Hi everyone. Today we are starting quarter 4, lesson 1 on the background into the Cold War. So this is going to be the first of 3 lessons that we spend on the Cold War, focusing on the standards Virginia U.S. History 12A and B. So a little bit about the start of the Cold War. The Cold War was a decades-long conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Neither country actually declared war on one another, but there were many other conflicts that took place during the Cold War that were results of the tensions between the countries throughout the world. The two major components of the Cold War was the United States and the Soviet Union, and this began in 1947. And at the time of the start of the Cold War, it was President Harry Truman. And something to be aware of with the United States is that we had a two-party democracy. So we had elected officials. We also had a capitalist society, meaning that people could own and operate their own businesses without government control. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was controlled at the time by Joseph Stalin, and they had a single-party government. So there was only one political party. It was also communist, so everything was controlled by the government with very limited ability to own and operate your own businesses. Post-World War II outcomes, taking a look at the political, economic, and social consequences of the world after World War II ended. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, gave a very famous speech where he said an iron curtain had descended over Europe. And what he meant by that was there was a separation between the aspects of Eastern and Western Europe. You can see that Western Europe in blue was very much separated from the Eastern Europe, which we see in red. Western Europe was capitalist, mostly democratic. Eastern Europe was mostly communist, mostly single party or utilitarian governments. And so there was a huge difference between the economy and living standards between these two parts. So we saw a stagnant economy in Eastern Europe, a very growing economy in Western Europe, and so on and so forth. To furthermore divide, we saw a huge division of Germany. So after World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, which you can see here. The British government, the Soviet Union, the United States, and France all had a piece of divided Germany. They were each one of the major allies. Western Germany became very democratic, so where we see the control from Great Britain, from France, and from the United States. This section was all democratic. They had free elections, very much unlike East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, which was not democratic. So they did believe in the communism and single-party government. The exception being Berlin, and we're going to get into Berlin here in the next slide. Berlin was the capital of Germany. Berlin is in this part of Germany. So Berlin was also, so this is the city of Berlin. So Berlin was also divided into the 4 sections. The Russian section, and then the French, the British, and the American section. And it was divided by the Berlin Wall. So there was actually a wall that divided these two in half. And as a matter of fact, if you would have gone to the museum actually had a chunk of the Berlin Wall in the museum, which was pretty cool to see. So the idea was that the city would be unified. However, the Soviet Union, so this should actually say, instead of Russia, the USSR, so it was the Soviet Union at the time. The Soviet Union would not give control or give up part of its city. And so the city became divided into East Berlin and West Berlin. So East Berlin was under Soviet control. West Berlin was under democratic control. The Berlin Wall did eventually come down much, much later. but this is how the city functioned for a few decades under the Cold War governments. So the United States had a big fear of communism and this idea of communism spreading. And so they came up with a variety of different plans throughout the Cold War to try to attempt and stop the spread of communism. The first being the Marshall Plan, which happened in 1947. So what happens is over here to the left, this is Europe after World War II. So you can see how devastated it looked, right? So they needed finances, they needed support. Many of their factories had been destroyed. So the U.S. gave financial aid as a total of $12.5 billion to help rebuild European economies. And the idea was that if they gave this money, then they would stop the spread of communism. People wouldn't be as tempted by communism because they had the support that they needed. Now, Eastern countries were able to use this. However, many turned it down because of the Soviet Union's control over them. And here you can see a political cartoon. You can see the doctor, the U.S. Congress is trying to rush to Western Europe to try to help them and save them. But right now they're racing against communism, which is carrying chaos with it. Japan after World War II, Japan had strict limitations placed on it. General MacArthur was responsible for overseeing Japan and organizing their new government. It was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. Japan did have a very limited military capability, so they limited how big their army and navy could get. And then the U.S. committed to protect Japan. So they said, you can't have an army, but we promise to protect you if you're ever attacked. And it allowed Japan to focus on rebuilding their economy. And since then, Japan and the United States have had a traditionally very strong relationship and have been strong trade allies. The United Nations, which is still in existence today, formed in 1945. Very similar to the League of Nations, which we tried to form after World War I, but failed because the U.S. never participated. The United Nations is still very powerful and still very much a force today. The general purpose of the United Nations is to provide a way for all nations to work together and try to avoid war. It was written after World War II. It was first founded in San Francisco, but now has headquarters in New York. And a few Cold War themes that you need to be aware of that it's going to come up over the next 3 lessons. The first is containment, and that's the idea of stopping the spread of communism. What can we do to contain communism? We don't want communism to spread, so how do we stop that? The second is domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, then other countries are also going to fall to communism, so how do we stop that from happening? The third idea is massive retaliation, using the threat of complete war as a deterrent to attack in order to keep the peace. And this is what helps back the arms race. So this idea of we could go to nuclear war at any moment, tried to, using that threat, actually helped, in fact, keep peace because people were so afraid of going to nuclear war that they were willing to at least communicate to some degree so they wouldn't go to war. Brinkmanship, existing near a state of war, so each side would take great care not to upset the balance. We were on the brink of nuclear war. And then finally, the arms race, which was a rapid buildup of military-grade weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union.